It might seem strange to find an opera house in a small Mediterranean island, but that's not the only thing that's unusual about Menorca. It's an island of contrasts, traditions, even contradictions sometimes, and above all, of variety.
The history of Menorca is really the history of Marne Harbour. Not only the best in the Mediterranean, it rivals Pearl Harbor as the finest natural deep-water anchorage in the world. No wonder that something like 11 civilizations have overrun this small island. In the 18th century, she changed hands so frequently between Britain, Spain, and France that it must have felt like changing partners in a barn dance. Throughout their history, the Menorcans have survived amazingly well. In spite of having their towns demolished and their oak forests cut down for foreign fleets, they put up with their conquerors, learned what they could from them, and the result is a rich and varied culture. But today, they're faced with a new kind of threat. For the first time in their history, they're up against a non-violent invasion, and it could prove the most disastrous.
This morning will be an introduction to the island of Menorca. Also, may I introduce your driver this morning, Paco?
Now the airport can take the latest jets, the tourists are likely to reenact a sort of speeded-up history and flood the island with several civilizations at once. In the forefront are the British, who occupied Menorca 3 times.
Everywhere you will find evidence of the British occupation. In the architecture, the people, even in the language. Because of this close associations, the British are still very popular here today.
The question is, what kind of mementos are these descendants likely to leave behind them?
When my family and I first came to Menorca about 5 years ago, it took us up to 4 hours walking through thick scrub and over rough ground to find this old Moorish lighthouse here, and also the remains of the Moorish garden that is further up the little cove. Of course, nowadays, as you see, bulldozers are moved in, and the excavators, they're moving soil, they're cutting away the scrub, they're building roads, and in no time at all, I suppose, there'll be houses and villas right across this particular part of the coastline. What is particularly interesting about this Moorish lighthouse is that they built a fire up in the center, and that fire would shine through the little hole, and ships out at sea would keep that fire within their sights. And if they kept the fire in their sights, then they would guide themselves safely into this sheltered cove here. And once they lost sight of the fire, then they could well crash onto the many rocks along this particular part of the coastline.
The seabed is littered with remains going back to the Phoenicians. It's a happy hunting ground for the divers, but they're strictly controlled and not allowed to sell their finds anywhere but at the island's museum. The rewards are such that they guard their secrets as jealously as a sultan his harem, and won't breathe a word of anything they find to even their closest friends. Most of the remains lie in the mouth of Marne Harbour, which is fairly narrow and difficult to negotiate. As it has been used throughout history by all the major trading nations travelling between Europe and the Middle East, most of the wrecks are merchantmen. And on the seabed, therefore, you'll find mainly pots and tools, and on occasions, amphorae. In the 3rd century, the Balearic Islands, of which Menorca is one, were infested with pirates who ransacked ships crossing the western Mediterranean. It's obviously in the hope of finding at least one rich pirate wreck that the divers go down so often to the ocean bed. But one is cynical enough to wonder, what would happen if a diver did hit the jackpot? How much of it would find its way into the local museum? The very attractiveness of the diving could prove its undoing. The day can't be far off when Menorca will be plagued with skin diving clubs, the kind of thing that's already bedeviled its sister island of Mallorca. When that happens, underwater buccaneers will carry off anything they can find, knowing there's a ready market for even a bent nail, provided it's old enough. The remains on land create other problems. These monuments are towers, found only in Minorca. In 1931, a Cambridge expedition excavated this one and the Navetta behind and published 3 volumes about them. But to this day, no one really knows what any of these structures are, who put them there, how on earth they got them up, and for what purpose they were used. Anywhere on the island you'll come across other groups of massive stones, all almost equally as baffling. The point is that hardly any serious research has been done. You can let your imagination run riot and call something a baby's bath, and maybe hit upon the truth. But try to convince a Menorcan that his past needs facts and not fantasy. You meet a puzzling, glazed indifference, or perhaps just manana tomorrow. Luckily, there are exceptions. Tucked away miles from anywhere, with no road or map reference, is a Roman basilica, and possibly the remains of a Roman town under the fields nearby. Again, no one's quite sure. This 85-year-old farmer was ploughing one day when he brought up a piece of mosaic. He realized its importance and took it along to the museum in Marne, one of the few places active in preserving the island's past. Under their supervision, he painstakingly reassembled the whole thing bit by bit over a period of 4 years. It turned out to be the finest on the island, and much too large for the museum. So they provided a roof, a fencing, and a padlock for the gate. Though who'd want to dig it up and carry it off, I can't imagine. It seems, however, that the more dubious the history, the better its chances. In a private house called Golden Farm is preserved a shrine to Nelson. Now, he certainly visited Minorca, but there's no proof he ever stayed at Golden Farm. But that hasn't deterred the owners. They keep the room as they imagined it was when the Saviour of England did, or didn't, work in it, and display a letter to his dearest, beloved Emma, the original of which is in a British museum. To remind him of his cabin, he's been assigned the smallest bedroom in the house, where presumably he spent a peaceful night, whilst, of course, still aboard his flagship. His Admiral Collingwood, on the other hand, did stay in Minorca, in this house. The style, Minorcan Georgian. There's no doubt that Collingwood lived and worked here. The result, it's now a hotel. These caves, though less luxurious, were the homes of the first inhabitants of the island. Nowadays, passing travellers drop in. Fishermen sometimes live in them. One of them must have needed a postal address. But where did those ancient cave dwellers come from? Were they fleeing from something? How did they get up there? Again, silence. Can these questions be answered before it's too late? Some think not.
It's a beautiful island. We sort of feel that within a couple of years it won't be unspoiled. I don't know whether I'd come back or not.
Well, whatever is said, as I've heard other people say, that it's not going to be spoiled, I think it's inevitable. And you've only got to look at that thing over there, and you can see what may well happen. You can imagine what's going to happen up here when you get 1,000 people over there. You're going to have graffiti all over the place, and on the other side there, you're going to have the Mia spoiled completely. All the birds over there, if they've got any sense at all, will just pack up and go. And what worries me is where they're going to go to. There was a lovely place over there that should have been preserved. And it can't be preserved. It's already been spoilt once those people arrive.
There's a lot of Minorca which won't be spoiled up in the north. It's quite deserted and...
Well, there's a lot that may not be spoilt for a long time, but I think pressures will inevitably spoil that as well.
I think the government here have got experience from what's happened in other parts of the Balearic Islands and elsewhere, and they're planning more methodically and carefully.
Well, they may be planning, but I don't see any evidence of the self-denial you've got to have to maintain this island reasonably beautiful. I think money will talk in the end.
Menorca was the last place to give up fighting in the Spanish Civil War, and investment in the island dried up. Forced to stand on their own 2 feet, what better than to build up their shoe industry? Along with this, they developed their processed cheese industry and artificial jewelry. Gin, the popular local drink, remains the same as when it was first brought to the island by the British. It is to the Menorcans what whiskey is to the Scots, only a lot cheaper. Today it still gurgles along the same pipes as happily as it did over 180 years ago. Everyone was afraid of tampering with the machinery in case they destroyed the potency of the secret formula. So they let well alone and compromised by redesigning the label. In under 40 years, then, the Menorcans have achieved a new prosperity. There's no poverty, except for one beggar, and they're rather proud of him, and trade is good. Most of them would say they don't need the tourist. Others, the more aristocratic, insist that they never really wanted him in the first place. But he's there already, and wanted or not, is helping to change the landscape. The government policy does limit development areas and regulates design, but sometimes it's difficult to see where. So little seems to have been planned consistently. Architects have been allowed to put up tedious rows of bungalows or villas without any imagination. Alongside the good, you can find buildings which are bad, eccentric, or just plain dull. There are also the huge impersonal blocks, which look like city centres transplanted to the seaside, almost pushing the beach into the sea. The tourist who walks only 20 yards a day to and from his air-cooled luxury may not worry much about the changing character of an island he never sees. Some designers, however, have tried to create this character for him with some curious results.
This is Bini Becker Vell, or Bini Becker Town. It sounds Moorish, it certainly looks very Moorish, and you might be forgiven for thinking that this was built by the Moors many centuries ago, but actually it is part of the modern invasion. It's finished up, to my mind, looking rather like a doll's house or a noddy town, a cross between Walt Disney and Hans Andersen. Though, when you think of the type of holiday homes and chalets you get in our country, the architecture is a vast improvement. And certainly it's great fun to wander around the narrow alleys because each little lane comes back on itself and you never quite know which house you're in. Oh, you don't walk into somebody else's bedroom, you're probably all right.
In summer, of course, many beaches are crowded. The tourists spend a lot of money, and the Menorcans are happy to receive it, but not too happy about the price the island has to pay. Santiago, who with his family owns a beach bar, speaks for many others.
Well, I think perhaps about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, it could be getting spoiled. I hope not, anyway.
But you're a Menorcan, are you worried about that?
Well, I think Menorcan people are used to it, aren't they?
Well,
We had many invasions, English, French, Italian even, I don't know, Moorish.
Yes, but this invasion is all happening so quickly. It's a cosmopolitan
Well,
one.
that's the third invasion, I think, is the biggest one as well.
And do you think Menorca can cope with it? Can they absorb this invasion?
Well, it's a very small island, isn't it? I don't know. That's what I'm worrying about, you see. If too many people comes here, it's going to be very crowded, and then it's going to be spoiled.
The most far-reaching development scheme has already started. Aimed at both tourists and residents, it offers them, well, simply paradise. The man responsible is Sigi Federman, a much-traveled and experienced property developer.
This is going to be the center of Shangri-La, that is true. It's an 18-hole golf course, a championship, 6,800 yards.
But it seems that you're building almost a town here.
Well, you couldn't call it actually a town, even so it is big. We are going to have about 1,000 houses here.
And schools?
And a school,
Church?
church, everything that goes with it, of course.
Would this be for Menorcans as well as for tourists?
We have Menorcans who have bought here too and want to live all year round, especially if you take in consideration that it is very near from Mahon.
Yeah. How are you going to
5 kilometers.
how are you going to preserve some of the character of the country and the...
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, there's a beautiful Menorcan house over there. Will that remain in the development? or
That will remain in the development as the country club. We'll build next to it 8 tennis courts, and this house will be the clubhouse with the restaurant, but it's going to be kept in that same style. We're going to add to it, because it's small, as you can see, for the big club that's going to be, but we're going to build around it. We're not going to change that house.
is there not the chance that you might impose something on the island rather than allowing it to develop naturally?
No, I do not feel this way. Quite the contrary. I think that Menorca, who is a rich island by itself because of its industries, has given certain standards of developments for something like us, which will keep it at a high level and will not affect the life at all.
Stick a pin anywhere in Europe and you'll find an American. Jim Mapps settled here with his family and one obsession, history. He chases facts like a butterfly collector. But facts about the Isla del Rey, or King's Island, in the middle of Marne Harbour are difficult to come by. We know that the island received its name from King Alfonso of Spain, who landed here in 1287 to free Minorca from the Moors. Later, the British, with typical bluntness, renamed it Bloody Island because of the military hospital they built.
So this is the hospital, is it, Jim?
Yes.
It's a beautiful building, isn't it?
It's a great example of 18th century British naval military architecture.
When you say military, is it because of the design?
Well, it's just the design of the time. At the beginning of the 18th century, we had a certain type of architecture, but this was built in 1776, near the end of the century. This was the sort of architecture of that time.
And those little towers there, those are cisternas where they collected the water?
Yes. The entire roof system sort of collected the water into the cisterna because there's actually no well on the island.
Yes. And of course it's deserted now.
Yes, it's been deserted for many, many years.
Was that after the Spanish took the island back from the British?
Yes, they have their military hospital in the outside of town.
It was once rumored that a holiday camp had its eyes on the place. Then that a famous prima donna wanted to buy it. She probably lost interest when she learned the island was once used for military hangings. The latest scheme is for a summer school. The peaceful atmosphere would make it an ideal place for study, and students might give some serious thought to the building's history and design. Not far from the hospital is an island called Lazaretto, Quarantine Island. It was built by the Spanish, and passengers and crew had to receive medical clearance here before disembarking at Marne. There's only one other place in the world like it, at Marseille. The enormous walls make it look like a fortress, but the idea was not to keep an enemy out, but contagion in. The Spanish, when they finally got the island back from the British, in a fit of exuberance, put a couple of lions above the gateway. They then found they were British lions, so to put matters right, they placed their flag above them. Lazaretto means leper colony, and anyone confined here could well feel like a leper. But it was typhus, cholera, and smallpox which were rife in those days, and the Spanish seemed to have thought of everything in trying to contain them. Living quarters are self-contained, and judging by the grills, those who could were able to receive visitors at a safe distance. The exercise yards are more like exercises in geometry, each having their own separate entrance. The design is an ingenious maze. It seals off one disease from another, as well as milder cases from severe ones. Those who were not affected by disease, but who had been on a ship which had reported several cases, were probably placed in cubicles near the perimeter. But for the unlucky ones, and there were many, other arrangements were made. Where death is, the church is never far away. And sure enough, Lazaretto boasts its own chapel. But imagine the effect on the fever-ridden congregation when, having staggered along a complicated system of separate passageways to drink in words of comfort from their priest, they found him sealed in a birdcage of protective glass that effectively prevented every syllable of his from being heard. There's a corner of Minorca that is forever America, and all the power of their mighty Sixth Fleet has come to claim it. But the Minorcans seem blissfully unaffected by it all. That's probably because they're old friends. They have close associations going back to the early 1800s, when America had her first overseas naval base here and trained her midshipmen until she built her own naval academy in America.
Pipe aboard.
The American Navy never forgets that their first full admiral, David Farragut, was the son of a Minorcan. But at the edge of Marne Harbor, Jim Mapps discovered a little piece of America they did forget. It took only one article by him in an American magazine to stir the conscience of a nation. From Washington, a direct command went out to the Navy. American soil is being overrun. Send in the fleet. This was done. And since then, a warship returns every year. On this occasion, under the command of Captain Charles Gurney III, to carry on the task and keep American honor bright.
It is certainly overgrown.
You can see it needs whitewashing, too.
Yeah, and a little weed cutting, you might say.
How many days do you think this will take?
We've got at least 3. I would say with all we've got 3 days, we could put it in pretty good shape.
This is where we usually put the wreath on Memorial Day, which is May 30th. About 2 years ago, Mr. Volpe came over from Washington, American ambassador, commander-in-chief of the Sixth Fleet. This year we're going to have the American ambassador coming, and a lot of dignitaries, probably some Spanish admirals and different people from Madrid and so on.
When did the people in the United States Navy stop using the...
1842, that's the last one. That's the man who was assassinated over there.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done, men.
Let's get to it.
Yeah.
This looks like quite a lengthy epitaph here. It says, in memory of William Malloy, native of Troy, state of New York, laid a cooper on board the U.S. ship Delaware. His adze becoming edgeless, his staves worm-eaten, his hoops consumed, his flags expended and bungs decayed, he yielded up his trade and with it his life on the 2nd of April, 1829, aged 48 years. His messmates have erected this stone as a memorial of their esteem and their respect for his character. It's very interesting. Well,
Lisa, no, I wish I was doing right. That way I wouldn't feel I was digging somebody up or something. Oops, sorry, mate.
24th of December, 1856. He's a pretty old guy. He was 34 years old.
I don't know how old this thing is. Looks fairly...
1959.
Yeah.
The surroundings, kind of dreary. Now the hard part is I just painted myself in.
The Menorcans take grave matters rather more seriously. The fiesta of Holy Week in Marne goes back at least 500 years. The sinister hoods remind one of the Spanish Inquisition. It's not a local festival, being common throughout Spain, though the Menorcans add their own individual touches. And it's a very elaborate procession for such a small island. Religion has always had a very powerful influence in Menorca, helping to unify the people in the face of so many invasions. The hierarchies and divisions are marked very strictly, and the procession reflects this. Each group of penitents represents something from the Passion, either a symbol like the crown of thorns or an emotion like humiliation. There are 14 groups in all, each with its own distinctive colors, and they march in a prescribed order. Why they march with such a pronounced sway remains something of a mystery, but it's said that the style is certainly helped for some by the contents of various bottles hidden under their voluminous robes. The British governors of Menorca exploited the island for all they were worth, except one. Being Irish, he probably knew about the sufferings of a downtrodden peasantry, and he set about helping the Menorcan one. He drained large areas of marshland near Marne Harbour, planted new orchards, introduced new plants and crops. He imported foreign strains of cattle, sheep, and poultry, brought in a proper system of weights and measures, and made their use compulsory. Richard Kane is forgotten in this country, but in Menorca they put up a statue to his memory, and still use the road that he built to link Marne, his new capital, with Ciudadela, the ancient capital. It's still called Kane's Road, and in places it's the same as when first constructed in early 1700. Ciudadela is a city of palaces, some of them maintained to a standard fit for a reigning monarch. Most of these buildings were put up in the middle of the 18th century by noblemen who'd fled from Spain. Many of the families still living in them are their direct descendants. Living is perhaps an exaggeration. They spend time in them, usually less than 6 months a year. For the rest, they might go to Spain or shuttle between the capitals of Europe. They'd say they're trying to preserve the best of Menorca. Some even refuse to sell any of their land for development. A member of one of the oldest families who rarely leaves the island and is devoted to it is Gabriel Saura. But like so many others, he's in the awkward position of indirectly destroying what he wishes to preserve.
In my house, we have about 17, 20 rooms.
20 rooms.
I don't know the number exactly.
How many of the rooms do you use?
About 6 or 7.
Yes, and what do you do with the other rooms that you
Other
don't-
rooms, like exposition, like a museum, you know, like for keep the furniture.
Yes.
I think all is antique.
Gabriel, you have many beautiful antiques in your home. Do you just keep them, or do you sell some?
No, I'm in my house. I prefer to keep
Yes.
because it's a beautiful antiques, and I am no need to sell these antiques. Now I am to look for the Barcelona Catalans and from the Madrid people, or for the Spanish people who's coming to making a holiday in Menorca. I look for antiques for them. You know?
So they're buying
Yes.
and taking them back to Spain
Yes.
and the mainland.
Yes.
And
I
aren't you
send
worried
them.
about your... There can't be many antiques in Menorca. Aren't you worried
Yes,
about them
I think in Menorca, in 4 or 5 years, it's finished, the antiques.
Oh, I
Because
hope not.
everybody like it now, and it is a fashion now, the antiques in Menorca, you know.
A lot of what Gabriel Saura sells, he finds in farms like this. Less than 1/10 of the population of Menorca is now employed working on the land.
Hey, 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 hey!
The measured pace and calm of this traditional farm is almost a thing of the past. The famous handmade cheese, once a major export, is being thrust aside by the processed variety, stamped out by Swiss machinery and wrapped in tinfoil.
Hey, 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 hey!
Mechanization has taken over, and what was once a leisurely agriculture based on cereals is now giving way to intensive breeding for milk and meat.
Hey, 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 hey! Hey, 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 hey!
They have spirits broke to servitude and bodies inured to labor. They are effectually subdued to a blind obedience to those that are set over them. So wrote an Englishman about Menorca in 1752. In no way would that apply today. The first thing you'll notice about the Menorcans is how proud and independent they are. Although they're still subject to a rigid class system, no one seems to suffer from it. There's no touching the forelock or playing the country squire. Socially, it's true there's little mixing between classes, but in their work the Menorcans regard themselves as equals. The nearest parallel is the spirit of our old trade guilds, where pride in the job went hand in hand with a sense of community. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the close bond between the farmer and his workers. As with all well-furrowed relationships, you're aware of a world of shared experience lying behind the words. But this sensitive relationship is in danger of collapsing. In the last 20 years, there's been a steady drift to the towns. With the tourist boom, it has accelerated. Hotels and restaurants are mushroomed up, offering wages the farmer can't possibly compete with. and anyone in possession of a plot of land can find himself rich overnight. So why saddle himself with a long payroll or mechanize with expensive equipment? Across the water, not far away, stands a somber warning of what can happen. Ibiza, thrown wide open to the tourist, has lost its identity. Most Menorcans are aware of this, but claim that as long as their own traditions are kept alive, there's little danger from outside. They point out that their most important festival, the Feast of St. John the Baptist, unites the island like a call to arms. Possibly they miss the irony that the central role is always given to a farm worker, a figure that's disappearing from their society. He carries the Lamb of God, which as the island became more and more prosperous, grew bigger and better and ended up as a ram. The week before the fiesta, a house-to-house procession visits every important person in the city to raise horses and money for the climax of the festival on Midsummer's Day. One would imagine that the clergy would be delighted over this show of religious fervour, but they're worried, the Bishop of Ciudadela among them. They believe the fiesta is now being turned to an exhibition for the tourist, its deeper significance overlooked and cheapened, especially among the young. The festival began in the 14th century and was probably brought by the Knights of St. John of Malta, whose flag heads the procession. All the ancient records were destroyed when the Turks stormed Ciudadela in 1558 and razed it to the ground. So the original meaning of all the symbolism has been lost. But we do know the peak on the ram-bearer's forehead began as a halo and evolved into a sun shield. In each house they receive food and drink, and then, following tradition, always turn right on leaving. The drink is a fairly potent local concoction, so that by the end of the day, telling right from left can present problems. Usually the ram is given to the bearer as a gift, but this time the owner was so pleased with the animal, he decided to keep it himself and give the farm worker money instead, which was a pity, really. After a long, hot day of being carried, you can't feel completely indifferent to the person who's been so close to you. And it was a very affectionate ram. Six days later, on the morning of June the 23rd, Ciudadela prepares for the fiesta. It goes on well into the night and spills into the side streets, filling the bars and restaurants, and continues through to Midsummer's Day. The rich trappings of the horses are traditional and handmade. There's one class distinction, so to speak. Noblemen's horses have their tails left free. Peasants' horses have their tails plaited. Every year the form is the same. The man on the donkey, who might represent Christ entering Jerusalem, goes about the city rounding up the horsemen who are dressed in Napoleonic costume. Originally, the horsemen were knights and men-at-arms, but with the changing times, they gave way to landowners and farm workers, professional men and tradesmen. In fact, anyone who was a skilled horseman. The Menorcans throw hazelnuts to unseat the riders as they try to show off their skill in leaps called caracoles. The Menorcans will keep up their celebrating throughout the night, until Midsummer Day lurches in for them about mid-afternoon. Then the festival begins all over again with a formal procession to the jousting area. The jousting, which has also changed over the years, is a remnant of the 14th century, when skill at arms seemed a healthy outlet for religious high spirits. The fireworks mark the end of the official fiesta. The unofficial one will go on well into the morning. Afterwards, the Menorcans can settle down to make the most of the tourist season, which from the end of June moves into top gear. Long live Hugh de Della. Long live Menorca. Vain hope or not. In a country no bigger than the Isle of Wight, there are over 120 beautiful beaches, most of them still unspoilt. A holy land indeed for our jet-age pilgrims. Can the Menorcans survive them? Or will their habit of absorbing an invader rather than fighting him mean that they are now seeing the last of their quiet island?